Hello, this is Derek Taylor. This is IHST 141, lecture for America since 1877. And lecture for this week is on urbanization and what I'm calling the new American city in the late 19th, early 20th century. Because what you're going to have happen is there've been cities, obviously, in the United States before this period. And they've always been, well, that's what civilization means, is the growth of cities, but cities don't stay the same over time, long term and also short term. Relatively speaking, in human history, there are different types of cities and different types of civilizations throughout human history, and you're going to have a brand new type, a type of city, by the way, which almost doesn't really exist anymore, at least in the United States, and that's the industrial city. You guys, you're taking this class, you're probably young, you don't remember anything like that. That's what we're going to talk about today, and the ramifications of this, because the United States comes in this period from 1880 to about 1920, goes from being a predominantly rural country to being an urban one. These are huge changes. Urbanization is always a huge change, but also going along with industrialization is massive. So an era of rapid, constant, and important changes. And I just wanted to read something to you, to give you an idea of this. And this is a little brief. Well, I'll show you the book in a second, who wrote it. But cities were a concern in the late 19th century to social reformers, as well as people who worked in government. So let's read this. The city has become a serious menace to our civilization because in it, excepting Mormonism, each of the dangers we have discussed is enhanced and all are focalized. It has a peculiar attraction for the immigrant. Our 10 larger cities at that time, he means in the 1860s, he's writing in the 1890s, contained only 9% of the entire population, but 23% of the foreign. The fundamental idea of popular government is the distribution of power. It has been the struggle of liberty for ages to wrest power from the hands of one or the few and lodge it in the hands of the many. Centralized wealth is centralized power. And the capitalist and corporation find many ways to control votes. The liquor power controls thousands of votes in every considerable city. It's long, I know. The president of the Mormon Church casts, say, 60,000 votes. The Jesuits, and this means the Society of Jesus, which is a religious order within the Roman Catholic Church, it is said, the Jesuits, it is said, are all under the command of one man in Washington. The Roman Catholic vote is more or less perfectly controlled by the priests. That means that the Pope can dictate some hundreds of thousands of votes in the United States. Is there anything un-Republican in all this? And we must remember that if president tendencies continue, these figures will be greatly multiplied in the future. Unquote. I know it's a long passage, but I wanted to read it all because it captures a lot of the fears about the city. The new city, concentration of wealth, concentration of, well, foreign population, immigrants, and their possible control by wealthy interests who may try to subvert the efforts of voters at the ballot box, middle class voters, by sort of pandering to them, if you like. That's essentially what he's complaining about. And who is this? Who would write something like this? Is the kind of thing you think about. Okay, what kind of person would write this? Well, this is Josiah Strong, who was a Congregationalist minister. He's a Protestant. We'll get to him. I said 1890s. He's right in the 1880s. I forgot. Sorry. And we'll talk about this because a lot of the reformers you're going to see, social reformers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, come out of Protestant churches. In fact, that's where a lot of the reforms, going back to abolitionism, come from in this country. Going into the future, the civil rights movement, a lot of it comes out of the Black churches. So, but that's a strong, he's also a politician, or not a politician, but a political reformer in addition to this. So all these things sort of come together. I thought was a good way of getting into this. Anyway, so part of this is that what's going on in the United States is not merely local to it. It's part of a global trend toward cities. I mentioned this before. There's, United States, my opening I mentioned, became an urban nation In 1860, less than 20% of the United States population resided in cities. By 1920, a majority of Americans lived in cities for the first time. As soon as 1900, 10 of the largest cities in the world were in the United States. And this is partly due, of course, to migration from abroad. It's also partly due to migration from the countryside. And this happens elsewhere as well. Overpopulation, populations begin to go up. Medicine's finally getting decent enough. People don't die when they're young, so they live longer. A lot of things like agricultural mechanization. We talked about this a little bit with the settling of the West. This forces rural people to look to cities for work, both in the US and abroad, wherever industrialization happens. Not just in places like Europe, United States, but in places like China and Japan in the 19th century experienced this. Booming cities like Shanghai, Tokyo, other places, and places in the United States become like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, regional, big, huge, metropolises. And you'll have other smaller cities as regional manufacturing and processing centers, which will be pronounced, as I mentioned last time, in the West, but also will touch the South. Finally, by the beginning of the 20th century, places like Birmingham become steel producing areas. So you'll have the entire country, again, becoming more one national economy, one more nationally governed entity. And so it sees the demise of what your textbook calls the walking city. Again, prior to the spread of industrialization in the 1840s, 1830s, most cities were, formed around rivers or on, ports where you could walk them. Well, with the growth of these cities, the scale and complexity of them goes off the roof. Not in terms of physical distance, which they do, but also in terms of social complexity. Urban dwellers get sort of jumbled around by class, race, and ethnicity. Even as governments and businesses are trying to overcome, the limits of space in, national markets and stuff like this. At the same time, these urban cities are going to become the crucible for a lot of reformers. Again, as that little passage there from Josiah Strong indicates, a lot of people saw the new city as a huge challenge to self-government. Classical liberals, what that term means. Classical liberal means small government, individualism, that sort of thing. Classical liberals were already skeptical of uneducated Americans having the right to vote, and the influx of immigrants from abroad made them even more worried about this, as that passage made clear. All these tensions exacerbated the class divisions we talked about last week. And you can kind of see this. You're going to have a term used for these cities, megalopolis. It gets used by writers in Europe in the 19-teens by Oswald Spengler. Cities in Evolution, The Decline of the West. Later on in America, Lewis Mumford in the 1930s took a book called The Culture of the Cities as being a unique problem because it presented all this novelty, but also exacerbating all these existing tensions. And so it seemed to be a threat to Republican virtues of self-reliance and self-government. Now, what is an industrial city? How is that different from the cities you're familiar with? Kansas City today, maybe you've been to New York City, something like this. Well, of course, the advent of steam power, industrialization, manufacturing, cheap labor altered the physical nature of these cities. All of a sudden, they become too big for you to get across walking. You have to have transportation. In 1887, and then Frank Sprague, I pronounce that, invented an electric trolley system as the main mode of transportation in Richmond, Virginia, of all places, to get around this. This is where you'll also have, in the 1860s in Europe, the development of the first, well, you have trains already, but you'll have elevated and underground transportation. The first subway in the world opened in 1863 in London, which had been gone totally electric by 1890. The first elevated train in the United States was built in New York City in 1871. And in 1897, Boston opened the first subway, Manhattan following in 1904. Again, you're having to find creative ways to use space because it's rolling out. Just as you need, by the way, transportation to get you outside of the city, because now for the first time you're having huge suburbs emerge outside of, well, of course, if the main, we'll get to this in a second, if the main thing in these cities is an industry, heavy industry, steel, stuff like this, creation like that, you're going to have what? You're going to have smokestacks, you're going to have pollution. It's nasty. Nobody wants to live there. Where they live, they go out to the suburbs. And so you're going to have people like Henry Huntington out in California, in LA, foster the ideal of a single affordable family home outside of the cities in suburbs. And also, of course, you'll have you mentioned the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, making it easier to talk to people at distances. So if you don't want to live with your anywhere near your in-laws, you can get the hell away from them. And you can just call them occasionally and visit occasionally. It means separation in social terms to a certain degree. For some people, for people who can afford that, others are stuck in the city, obviously. You also need to sort of, another way of getting around this problem of space, of course, is to build upwards. Steel girders and passenger elevators are available by the 1880s, and so you begin to have architects inventing the so-called skyscraper in Wall Street. The first one, 1885, in Chicago. And these buildings will be built up, right? There's only so much land to be had, means the price of land goes up, but also if you want to have more people to rent to, you build upwards. And so the first skyscrapers being the landscape, first in Chicago, then by the mid-1890s, New York sort of overtakes it. And then finally, one of the huge changes, this is a huge change in human history in some ways, the coming of electricity. During the 1870s, electric street lights will overtake, lamp lights, gas lights to brighten streets at night. And this is a revolution, because now you can spend, if you want, all night out in the city for the first time. Excuse me. This basically also, of course, makes going out at night less risky for crime, which there'd always been. But this is where it's New York got the phrase, got the moniker, the city that never sleeps. You don't have to if you don't want to. You have lighting. Huge change. Huge change. Thomas Edison, of course, invented the first usable light bulb in 1879, which also put electricity in American homes. By mid 1920s, 2/3 of American homes had electricity. So very quickly this happened. But just to give you an idea, one of the things. People, again, going from rural to urban means a couple of things. One, in rural areas, of course, before electricity, you would work from sun up to sundown, and you'd be inside all night. You wouldn't go out at night normally. Even in cities prior to this, there'd be lamps open and lamps out at night, but you wouldn't want to go out too much in it. This changed the way we live. So much so that it changed, in fact, the way historians talk about cities. I came across, I studied the early modern period in European history, which is about from 1500 to 1800. Came across the title of a book called The History of the Night in Early Modern Europe. And the idea was, because nobody had ever thought about this before, is what the hell are people doing at night in this period? Because you did have cities, they're smaller, but you have them. Because nobody ever thought about it, because nobody ever went out at night until the invention of electric lighting. So this literally changed the way we looked at our own past, the development of the electric city, so-called. And here, just to give you, again, a few reference points to talk about, this is a map, and I don't have the date on me. This is probably the early 1800s or late 1790s of Philadelphia. Again, notice, I want to say the town halls down on the river, the Delaware River, even though the river, Schuylkill River on the left-hand side. Again, most of what you would have in the city you could walk to. You see just how the way it's laid out. And so it's a very different, very older type of city. Then you come to Chicago, how it grows from 1865 to 1902, and you can kind of see it's from your textbook, but it makes the point really well. It starts out as a smaller place, but it becomes this massive, massive area. The center of which is the industrial heart of the city, business district, the industrial stuff around it. And then, of course, industrial areas around. And this is the Chicagoland area, the entirety of it. but you can kind of see how it grows in that period. Again, through rail lines, other things like that. A massive change in the makeup of the city. And one thing to think about here too is that there had been planned cities before in human history, and you saw on that map of Philadelphia they planned the streets out. But you're having a city that it's planned and then replanned and made over. It's a different type of entity from what preceded it. And here we just have a picture of the Home Insurance Building, Chicago, 1885. This is the first. I can't remember how many stories it is. I can probably count the windows. And it's not that high. In other words, it's not a huge skyscraper. This is considered to be the world's first skyscraper because it was bigger than anything else, I guess, at the time. The first time somebody hit on the idea of, maybe we can build higher, which they did. And then finally, just to give you some comparison, I didn't have a lot of pictures there. I should have that one from maybe Chicago or some other place, giving you an idea of what an industrial city looks like. This is Manchester from the United Kingdom in the 1870s, just all the smokestacks and everything. Again, it looks different. It looks very different than the type of cities you're used to, because there's no more heavy industry in cities anymore in the United States. They all left. That's part of the story of modern America since 1877. The phrase we'll hear again, deindustrialization. But we're not in that era yet. This is what it means to live in an industrial city, is living in Lone Plus, stuff like that. Also means different patterns of living for people. You're going to have ethnic neighborhoods that grow up in these big cities, and not just from out of the country, but young women from rural areas looking for work will come there, aid in this explosive growth. But they're also going to have, again, ethnic neighborhoods. This is almost not a thing anymore as much, but it's still, I guess. But when I was a kid, it was Irish in Boston. This is where we get the Boston Celtics from, obviously. Minneapolis, Swedes in Minneapolis. This is why the Minnesota Vikings are called the Vikings, because of immigration. Other cities, it's Germans. And so, when they come there, they're faced with a lot of difficulties, right? And this is why you get them huddling together for support. And in fact, in places where there are Italians coming together, they'll be recruited by what are called padroni, bosses, patrons, basically, who will find work for them in northeastern and mid-Atlantic cities. And again, institutions will grow up in these neighborhoods, newspapers, mutual aid societies, to meet each other's needs this way. So really sharply defined neighborhoods. Chinatowns, Italian parts of town, Jewish parts of town. And again, if you're wondering why, your first impulse is why they would be more welcoming these people in the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, again, it means more divisions. Coming to a country that's already facing serious divisions, that's why you get discrimination, unfortunately, a lot of other things. And it exacerbates some of those existing divisions. So it's not good, but there was a reason for it anyway. Same thing also, of course, applies to African Americans who also began migrating from the rural South to southern, but also the northern cities after the turn of the century. They faced, of course, maybe even more discrimination than immigrants did. Job opportunities are limited. They're usually limited to the service sector. As you're going to see, especially after World War I, they're going to be periodically subject to race riots, both in southern but also northern cities. So it'll be a vast shift for them as well, difficult transition to urban life. And then whether they arrive from the South, from Europe, from Mexico, or whatever, these new residents needed cheap housing close to their jobs. And so you would have speculators tearing down old houses and building tenements in their places that house 20 or more families per room, in very cramped, airless apartments. Sometimes these things are death traps. Eventually, reformers will begin to convince local governments to establish codes and stuff. This didn't apply to a lot of them already in existence. So very, in some places, not just bad and unhealthy, even dangerous places to live. Also part of this new landscape. And then finally, the new industrial cities are also the places where a new national urban culture develops. Remember, again, I come back to this because you have the creation of a really national market for goods developing in this period. You also have a national market for services like entertainment. Cities could be dangerous and unhealthy, could also be exciting. You could go and find popular entertainment there you couldn't get elsewhere, which is still true, of course. A little less so as we get further into the future here. Things like vaudeville theater are invented in the 1880s, 1890s. For a quarter, you could go to walk in any time, watch a continuous, nonstop sequence of musical acts, juggling, stuff like that, magic shows, other entertainment, to have your mind turned into Swiss cheese, basically. Also, of course, the creation of huge amusement parks for the first time, Coney Island, Atlantic City, stuff like that. And you also have amusement parks, which they had their origins in the excuse me, World's Fairs that were held in this period. So World Fair in Chicago in 1883, 1904, it was St. Louis. Who, again, they're supposed to be about education, but they also had entertainment areas, which became more permanent. So you can tell what really sells, obviously. You also have popular music taking off for the first time in a national way. By the 1890s, there was a publishing district in New York, Tin Pan Alley Song Publishing District, which produced the first national hits we had. And again, this is new because New York becomes the center of a national publishing industry. It never existed before. I'll give you an example of this. You probably heard the name Stephen Foster before. Stephen Foster was a oh boy, I can't remember the name. Oh boy, it was a songwriter. God, I can't remember the name of the songs. Not vaudeville, but anyway, these pre-Southern Civil War songs about African Americans. Anyway, they're considered racist today, which they are, but they were minstrel shows. It was a minstrel show singer. Okay, it was in my notes. I didn't find it quick enough. Okay, but anyway, he wrote songs for these shows before the Civil War, which were wildly popular. Some of them you can probably know the tunes to. They're that popular. Maybe not you. You're kind of young, but when I was a boy, I knew these tunes. Oh, Susanna, stuff like that. Camptown Racetrack, all that stuff. Anyway, go look it up. Google it. But he died almost penniless in 1864 because there was no copyright for individual authors back then. You had to establish the legal construct of this stuff. In other words, you needed the business side of this to be taken care of. By the 1890s, this happened, and with a national market, you begin to have, people like later on Irving Berlin, George Cohan, writing songs like "Over There." That's the big hit song during World War I, right? So you can have a national popular culture which crosses regions, races, ethnicities, and so on, so forth, including things like increasingly music that comes from African Americans. I'm thinking, of course, of ragtime, which will feed into the blues, which will feed into jazz, and then creation of pop music later on. Starts with people like Scott Joplin from St. Louis. His ragtime music was supposed to be, it's called ragtime because it's a ragged rhythm. It's supposed to be syncopated, offbeat. And he actually introduced it at the Chicago's World Fair in 1893. A couple more things, just to sort of, where all this stuff comes from in the cities. Urban ragtime ushered in dancing as a sort of popular pastime. Again, if you like nightlife, if you like that stuff, this is where this comes from. Initially, there were no dance clubs before the modern city was invented. So huge change there. Another huge change, of course, is relationships between the sexes. So you're coming from rural areas or from abroad, settling in a big city. It's big, it's anonymous. It means you don't have the same oversight you would have had as teenagers or young people in other areas, which means you can go out and, well, you can have more interaction with people of the opposite sex. This is where you get the custom of dating, where it comes from. Dating did not exist before the late 19th century. People didn't go on dates. What did they do? How would they meet each other? Their parents would hook them up in rural areas or anywhere else. It's only in these big cities, which are kind of anonymous, where gradually it became acceptable for a young man to escort a young woman out on the town at night. And so again, this opened up whole opportunities for sex, basically. and other things. All right, also danger, also violence, also stuff like that. So dating and casual sex become a thing for the first time. Also, of course, becomes, again, this is another thing that happens because the anonymity comes, you have the creation of the first subcultures of gay people in these cities in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, in places like New York City. So again, creates new social situations in the cities. There is also, of course, high culture in these cities. Now, I say this because they become, centers for things like museums and opera houses, in addition to news magazines and things like this. Oscar Wilde, the Irish playwright and critic, toured the United States in the late 19th century, once famously quipped that America was the only country that had gone from barbarism to decadence without ever having passed through civilization. And so the great and the good, the people, the robber barons, knew this and felt this. And so in the 1890s, late 1880s, 90s, they began founding all these, highfalutin type things, museums, libraries. For example, in 1892 in New York City, they opened a National Conservatory of Music, and they hired a famous Czech composer named Antonín Dvořák to run it for the first several years. He wrote some of his most famous works while in New York City, but also took the time to visit Czech communities in the Midwest, in particular Spillville, Iowa, to be exact. Other places, elites built things like, again, museums. I mentioned one of the better ones, the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, today the Chicago Art Institute, was founded with the help of Charles Hutchinson, a wealthy banker and philanthropist. And of course, people like Carnegie have their names on half the damn buildings in the country still. So they did this partly, of course, to advance themselves, but also, again, you can say a lot bad about these people. They did feel a sense of civic duty. They thought they should make the country more beautiful, build more better buildings, build libraries. Carnegie libraries did, I think, good things by providing books to people to read. So that's also a part of it. It's also, of course, you get the creation of yellow journalism. Again, national market for advertising, creates newspapers with national circulations. People like Joseph Pulitzer, for whom the Pulitzer Prize for journalism is named. And of course, William Randolph Hearst, who was sort of the great newspaper magnate of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, establishing markets by printing sensational investigations of scandals, murder, sex stuff, the usual stuff we think of today. And with the arrival of this type of journalism, you began to get things like Sunday color comics. And there was a book published in 1894, or a newspaper called The Yellow Kid, a comic actually, which lent their name to yellow journalism, a derogatory term for this type of mass market newspaper. And the reason why is, again, newspapers had become, by the 19th century, I've kind of glossed by this, part of my training as an historian is in the history of the press. And by this time, again, with the emergence of the first republics in Europe and the United States, journalism came to be seen as this noble calling, which was, part and parcel of self-government. And critics, again, thought the yellow journalism undermined democracy, undermined self-government controlled by the people, with all its, color photos, short, dumb articles, sensationalist stories. But a lot of this stuff was what immigrants used to do things like learn the language in this period. So they provided that sort of work, and you did have exposés written by journalists like Ida Tarbell, who wrote a series of exposés on John Rockefeller, and David Graham Phillips, who wrote a piece called "Treason of the Senate" in Cosmopolitan magazine, 1906, which documented this sort of corruption between U.S. senators and wealthy corporate interests. Politicians like Theodore Roosevelt would later call them muckrakers because they focused too much on the negative side of American life, but they did help spur reform. As you're going to see, journalists are part and parcel of the reform movement that's going to be called progressivism later on. So important for that reason, despite the fact that, yeah, it's kind of a challenge, again, to a lot of ideals people have. And so what about how you govern all this then, this humongoloid new city? Well, initially these new cities are governed by what are sometimes called urban political machines. And by political machines, that basically means the local government didn't do a whole hell of a lot. So private developers were relied upon to build streetcar lines, to provide, well, utilities, water, gas, electricity, because they didn't want to tax the residents for this. And so this preference for letting private enterprise build things, what urban historians sometimes call the private city, shaped by profit-seeking businesses, individuals, rather than rather than having the government do everything. Kind of an American thing, and to a large degree, to a certain degree. Sort of like the sort of alliance between state governments and private companies in the pre-Civil War era in the United States. But they built these political machines, did some of these, did some politicians, which were effectively, they're effectively social service agencies. They provide jobs, lending help, help with city bureaucracy, a lot of times for immigrants. And in New York, the most famous of these would be called Tammany Hall, lie with the Democratic Party, where the Tammany Society, that's what it's called, basically provided services for, well, among others, immigrants. And these urban machines usually consisted of three levels, or three sets of people. At the very bottom, you have precinct captains who know what's going on in neighborhoods. You have above them ward bosses, people to whom they answered. And at the top, city bosses who ran these operations. Basically, it's a patron-client system, if you know what that phrase means. It means instead of having a government where you elect officials to do stuff and that sort of thing, you basically, if you have problems and have no one to turn to, you go to a boss and you ask for help, for money, for this or that. And if this sounds like, by the way, The Godfather, you're exactly correct. That's where the mafia came from. They provided an illegal version of this to immigrants. This stuff that was going on with these urban machines was legal, but it's more or less the same thing. Yeah, it's a perfect way of thinking about it. Is the Godfather, actually. And so if you went to someone, they would do something for you in return for favors, in return for voting for them, or for looking, if you're a city official, looking for other way on a permit. And it did extract a price. In the 1860s, William Macy Tweed, who was the head of Tammany Hall, made that institution a byword for corruption. He was actually arrested in 1871 because he spent so much on a very lavish courthouse. And this led to the decline of the worst forms of corruption. Nonetheless, people like like George Plunkett, was also associated with Tammany Hall, declared that he was in favor of what he called, quote unquote, honest graft. Graft meaning the kickbacks you get for doing, for being an insider, as he was, from what he called merely dishonest graft. What's dishonest graft? Well, honest graft is where I get bribes based, but I also do what the public wants. Dishonest graft is where you're not doing anything for public good, you're just taking money. So, but that's the distinction there. And this is going to cause a lot of consternation among middle-class people who become the reformers, who are going to reform all this. They condemn these machines. They condemn the immigrants for supporting them. But of course, immigrants, for them, that's the only place they can get jobs, emergency help if they need it, certain medical services and stuff like this. And they did accomplish some things, some of these political machines. They built sewage systems, bridges, parks, sanitation projects. By the end of the century, Chicago had twice as many public parks as for example, as the much more, governmentally controlled city of Berlin in Germany, for example. And these are pretty remarkable, given the fact that you're having private enterprise do this almost alone. And as the decades rolled on, about the early 20th century, municipal agencies become far better organized. You're going to have again, they've had some achievements despite obvious failings of them. But two things sort of throw this in relief. One is that cities continue to get bigger. And so the limits of machine government become increasingly clear to everybody. In addition to problems of corruption, they simply can't begin to deliver on everything that they sort of need. And yeah, and so you're going to get this shift and this change. Oops, wrong way. you're going to get the limits of this becoming apparent, especially in the 1890s, because all of a sudden you're going to have a depression hit. Remember, now these cities are now bound up in a way they weren't before with national markets and also international markets. So if something fails in the national market, a big city is going to get hit, and they do. In the 1890s, working class unemployment in big cities reached, in some cities, I should say, reached 25%. As a quarter of the workforce was, a quarter of the people were out of work. And this radicalized a lot of urban voters. We'll come to next time. We'll talk about progressivism. You'll see the emergence of the first and only socialist party in the United States in the 1890s, Eugene Debs. Runs for government, runs for president many times, and never gets hardly more than a handful of votes, but it does radicalize people to a certain degree. And wrong way. Pardon. Yeah, and so you're going to have middle class reformers at a local level begin to make serious changes in response to this. They begin to advocate and get municipal ownership of utilities. Others will build public baths, gyms, swimming pools, playgrounds. Mayors will come to power, trying to battle corrupt streetcar companies to bring down fares. And they'll get elected, promising, reduction in crime, affordable housing, funding for schools. And they'll experiment with new forms of government, like the commission system. This is actually invented in all places. In Galveston, Texas, after a hurricane killed 6,000 people in 1900, the rebuilders adopted a commission system that became nationwide and became a model for government. Basically, what this meant was you create these small councils called commissions, who would then hire experts, urban planning types, and they would help make recommendations. They would go off of that. Cities would become forced to adopt referendum systems where voters can express what it is they want on key political questions. And I should mention a lot of these reforms are modeled on efforts in European cities. A lot of these urban reformers, we'll get to next time with the progressives especially, they drew from their personal experience of European city life. And in fact, the movement to make reforms is really a transatlantic one. It's not really an American thing, progressivism, in other words. And so you'll have this feeding into that. Next time we'll talk more about progressives as a political force. And finally, cities and social reform. When we come to that, there were several things that reformers targeted in cities. One of which was public health, cleaning up urban environments, which could be nasty. They could be disgusting. People became more aware of these, by the way, in the 1890s because of, again, journalists, reporters like Jacob Riis, whose sort of photographic expose, How the Other Half Lives, was published in 1890. This is the recently invented flash photography allowed for you to see pictures of people and how they lived. Some middle-class people were horrified by this. And indeed, one of the biggest problems of these cities in the 19th century was disease. It's only in the late 19th century that reformers, people began to understand the nature of germs, bacteria, and so American city leaders would adopt, clean water, sewage, and drainage projects. Things like quarantines would be used, as well as other things to help spread diseases. And according to one survey by 1913, American cities were spending about an average of $1.28 per person on health measures. Because again, people lived in really nasty circumstances in these big cities. Pollution was obvious in rural areas. This is difference between an industrial city and modern cities based on services and economic terms. You're probably not old enough to remember. It has nothing to do with industry, but just go back and look at TV shows made in the 1970s and 80s that are set in Los Angeles, and you'll see they have this fog hanging over the city all the time. Well, that's not industry, that's cars, of course. But you had a lot of that in a lot of cities in this period. There's no environmental regulation. That's really an unhealthy place to live. Children would play on piles of garbage, breathe in toxic air. They might consume poisoned, food and stuff like this. So more infant mortality rates and other things led urban reformers to promote things like hygiene. It is progressive reformers of the late 19th, early 20th centuries who are the ones who push for things like hand washing and other techniques to fight the spread of things like tuberculosis. Others urged the adoption of smoking laws and launched the so-called City Beautiful movement, aimed to make industrial cities healthier, nicer places. At the same time, you also have fears of unsafe food and drugs led to government action. Again, there's no regulation, any of this, until the early 20th century, when, again, one of these muckraking journalists, Upton Sinclair, publishes a novel, The Jungle, which exposes the conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants, not just labor exploitation, which he did, publishes it in serial form in 1905 and published a book in 1906, but just how utterly friggin' disgusting the actual meat was packaged into tins was. Rotten meat, filthy packing conditions. In other words, till it hit middle class people where they, because they're buying the stuff, it didn't actually do anything. But eventually they did. That same year, 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and created the Food and Drug Administration to oversee compliances with the new law. Thank goodness. You also have, as addition to campaigns for public health, you have campaigns against vice, and by vice I mean prostitution. You have big cities, you have more sex. You also have, but I don't mention this in your textbook, but it really, the Victorian era, late 19th century, really is the beginnings of the modern, well, I put it, modern porn industry. Like, you know, like, I don't go too much detail for obvious reasons, but a lot of that's available in these cities as well. That's part of cheap print as well. But a rise in prostitution, and there was a sort of scare, moral panic about white slavery, quote unquote, in the late 19th century, of young white women being kidnapped and forced into prostitution, which I don't know. I mean, given the prevalence of sex trafficking today, maybe that's less of a moral panic than we think it was. But there was this huge push to do away with this, centered in New York City. It's New York City is the epicenter of this, and the reason why, as I mentioned earlier in this that passage about from Josiah Strong, it was evangelical Protestants were behind almost all of these reform movements. And the center of one of the centers of evangelical Protestant life in the 19th century was New York City, if you can imagine it. Again, this goes back to the earlier, before the Civil War, but you have efforts to police these things and create things called vice commissions. Again, you know, women, you know, are being exploited. They have to go find, part of, of course, the real reason they're going into prostitution is they can't find better jobs, but they're also suffering severe abuse, domestic abuse at the hands of their husbands, sometimes away from them. So these vice commissions start early, late 1909 in the 19 teens, closing brothels. Police go down, shutting down red light districts across the country. In 1910, Congress passed the Mann Act, which prohibited the transportation of prostitutes across state lines. And so it did sort of close down brothels. It just produced more streetwalkers in the end, which again were more unregulated than the brothels. So again, the push-pull didn't work in favor of the prostitutes themselves. And then finally, you get, well, we have some photos here just to get into that. This is a picture of, I want to say this is in London, but I cannot be sure, from the 1880s or 90s. But again, this is what, you know, lower class or working class housing could look like. Again, this is why this became fodder for middle class reformers. It looked awful to them. They wanted to go change it. And this is from 1849, also from London. But again, outbreaks of things like cholera and tuberculosis were a huge, huge fear. And so you'd have things like this posted in places like London, taking precautions about not drinking water and stuff like this. This is the thing you had to deal with in these cities. And then finally, of course, you begin to have people you know, doing something about this. This is a cartoon, a hint at the boards of health, how our cities invite the cholera. You have them, again, this is these reformers, you have ladies and gentlemen's cast off clothing, again, insinuating that it's kind of nasty, impure milk, stale vegetables, tainted meat and fish. Then you have a skeleton handing apples to kids. It gets the point across. You're handing this food to your kids and it's killing them. Again, this is middle class reform idealism here, obviously. And then finally, you begin to have in cities, and again, I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again, you're going to have these, we get to this cities and social reform, you're going to have settlements. One of the responses to this being social settlements in big cities. And these emerge out of Christian urban missions, basically become educational and social welfare centers found in the 1870s, 1880s. A lot of these focused on things like tackling low wages and lack of daycare for women, for working mothers. Some of these created cooperative exchanges through which women could support themselves by doing things like needlework and crafts. And that's where it emerges into this social settlement. And this led to a project, the first of these that's founded in Chicago, is called Hull House by Jane Addams and Ellen Gage Starr. Was an idea they borrowed from, again, Europeans, from a place called Toynbee Hall in London, which they visited while touring Europe. And Jane Addams especially is, credited with this. She envisioned these settlements as a link between middle and working class people, where middle class reformers could come and learn what the hell it was working class people wanted. At first, her idea was to try to bring art and culture to the masses, but they didn't want that crap. So what she had the funny idea was, Adams, that these working class people and these immigrants already knew what they wanted, didn't need to be told. What they needed was resources and a political voice to advocate for them. And so she did this. And so they offered things, these settlements, like bathhouses, playgrounds, kindergartens, again, daycare, stuff like this. It's also, by the way, just to give you, talking about aiming at the practical needs of the working class, it's out of this that a nurse who volunteered at a Lower East Side settlement in New York, who was horrified by the suffering women from constant pregnancies, launched a national birth control movement. That would be Margaret Sanger. We'll get to her next time, a couple of weeks. She also began a campaign to control populations from eugenics. But in any case, by 1920, 62% of these workers in these settlements were women. And she had them all over the United States doing, founding things founding things like, again, libraries and gymnasiums for working men and women, employment bureaus, so on and so forth. Other thing they did, of course, was their goal was to push local governments to do more for these people. So they tried to get city government to take responsibility for the lives of these people as they had not before. And so they're transformative in this respect as well. 1 second. Whoop. One last thing to note about all this is you're also going to have middle class people beginning to involve themselves in, and Adams is part of this as well, is begin to take over, especially by the end of the period we're talking about here, social workers beginning to reject older models of Christian charity. Instead, they're going to use new social sciences to gather facts, advocate change, a social scientific perspective rather than a personal one, which kind of goes along with the whole idea of scientific management. Remember that idea from last time? We're going to use science to manage people's lives for them. It'll have some consequences, as you'll see when we get to progressivism. And then finally, all of this is going to eventually push its way into national politics. I mentioned the Food and Drug Administration, its act in 1906, affected by urban reformers who helped push that. The National Consumers League was formed to encourage shoppers to patronize only stores where wages and working conditions were fair. Labor organizations became root of national stature, including, by the way, there was a women's trade union league. Again, they were shut out from a lot of the major unions at the time. They formed their own. They would become allies, by the way, in the struggle for things like the vote as well. But you also had, again, you had at the state level laws being passed as you got to the early part of closer toward World War I. There's actually one single event that galvanized a lot of this, which was the Triangle Fire of 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. where a fire broke out in 1911, led to the death of 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women. What happened was the owners of the factory would lock it during the day, during working hours. They didn't want their employees running off with stuff. This is why when the fire broke out, the guy with the key, the foreman who had the key, was trampled. The key got lost. They got locked in, and well, some of them burned to death. Others, and this is again one of the grueling, grisly things about this, a lot of them jumped to their deaths. One of your photos you had in your last assignment was of bodies in the sidewalk. I remember as a child, there was a TV movie made about this event, and you can still find it on YouTube, but it disturbed the hell out of me when I was a kid, because what happened was you had these women who, rather than burn to death, they decided to jump to their deaths. And so onlookers came out and they saw these women jumping to their deaths in the middle of the street. And there was this weird thing. There was this young man who apparently came to the window, was helping, encouraging the woman to jump, and jumped out himself. We have records of this stuff. I think it's because they actually showed that in that TV movie I saw when I was a kid. It gave me damn nightmares. It was so disturbing. Anyway, I mentioned it because the impact of this was great. And I should mention, by the way, the irony of this: the Triangle Fire. The owners of that factory were Jewish immigrants themselves, who made good, dirt poor, came to the United States with nothing. But also, the Triangle Factory has actually had a reputation as being good to its workers. It had high ceilings, long windows, relatively high wages, made an attractive place to work. Now, you had efforts to organize at this place prior to this, but the owner shut it down. But it was still it was a desirable place to work. And so what you have, and actually in your textbook, you should find, or should be, I think, in the America textbook, a little excerpt recounting what happened at the fire. And so again, you had, when this happened, this shocked the hell out of people in New York. Again, it happened in broad daylight. It's a horrible thing. But it showed the country that, again, the limits of local governments, of private industry to deal with the problem. And so only stronger state and national laws could affect serious change, which probably owes partly its effect to, I think it's fairly, I think this is probably a good call on my part. It probably owes some of this the fact that, New York is, of course, the media capital of the entire country. So a lot of people heard about this. And so it will galvanize people to start making newer reforms in government. And so we began with that concern about the city. We have to do something about it because of immigration, because of class division, because of the concentrations of wealth in the cities, and the safety of people that live in them. And again, it probably didn't hurt that these were young women as well. Again, the Victorian age tended to see women as, delicate and fragile and everything. And so seeing, pictures of dead bodies of young women in the newspaper, that's horrifying stuff. So it galvanized things at the end of this period. And when I talk about next week, we're going to talk about the movement that's part of this, which is the progressive movement. That and the populist, which are two major national political movements. We've gone through national, industrialization, national, unification in terms of settlement, and now national growth of urbanization. Finally get to national politics next week and talk about progressivism and populism. So that is it. Hope I'll hear from you guys next time. Take care and be safe.